Now, people are odd about mushrooms. Mushrooms are odd to people. And people love to eat mushrooms. You'll find that a lot of professional mycologists, myself included, do not eat mushrooms much. And that's because I've been consulting for years on mushroom poisonings, and I've had to sort through stomach contents and things like that, looking for bits of mushroom to identify. So you'd lose your taste for mushroom soup when you see it as a second-hand product. So I'd just like to explain that I'm not really keen on eating mushrooms, and this is probably why. Now, mushrooms are odd because people like to hunt them, but they seem to treat them differently than a lot of other foods. They'll eat mushrooms that are in far worse shape than they would eat other types of food products. It's a running joke in the Mushroom Club. People ask if you can eat it of anything that you show them. You can show them a maggot-ridden, half-festering thing that was growing on dog poop, and those are, can you eat it? It's the first question. And then people always want to eat things that grow in their backyard for some reason. I'm constantly getting calls, and most other people involved with toxicology of mushrooms get calls saying, what is this? Can I eat it? It's growing in my yard. And so I don't think people phone up the bird line and say, I got some birds in my yard, can I eat them? Or, they have some flowering in their backyard and they phone up and can I eat it? But with mushrooms, for some reason, people do that. Okay, so that's the preamble. So now what I'm going to do here is talk about Darwin's elves. And by the way, Santa Claus and Santa's elves making the gifts, ironically or possibly poignantly, in German the word for poison is gift. So a poison mushroom is a gift pilz. So here we have Darwin's elves making gifts for little children. And okay, now, there are some myths involved with mushrooms, and these always come up, especially with people that learned mushroom identification in folk ways. They maybe come from a European or Asian country where mushrooms are a traditional pastime, and they've learned from their grandparents and their parents that certain rules apply to mushrooms. None of them are true. It does not help to boil a mushroom with a silver spoon to see if it turns the silver black. The truly deadly mushrooms don't turn silver black. And some edible mushrooms may well turn silver black. There's all sorts of things like that. In Asian countries, if it turns the rice a color, it's poisonous. If it turns onions a color, it's poisonous. Well, I've messed around cooking up some pretty poisonous mushrooms to test some of these. None of them work, right? Mushrooms that peel easily, it said, oh, if it peels, it's safe. Well, no, that's not true. The deadly mushroom peels quite nicely. There's no real characteristics of a mushroom per se that tells you whether it's edible or poisonous. You have to learn your mushrooms. And there's lots of mushrooms to learn. There's tens of thousands of mushrooms. So you can't just say, oh, if it's a certain color, it's edible. If it's another color, it's poisonous. None of that applies. There's no particular taste, no particular texture. And they grow in all sorts of different habitats. So some people say if it grows on wood, it's no good. Or if it grows in a pasture, it's okay. While poisonous mushrooms can grow in all sorts of different habitats. There's all sorts of different poisonous mushrooms. And they have nothing in common other than they cause interesting reactions when people eat them. And just because animals eat mushrooms does not mean the mushrooms are edible. Animals are not supergenii. Some animals may eat mushrooms, wander off, and die days later. You have to be willing to follow a squirrel for weeks to be sure that it's okay. And animals do die of poisonings. It's not as though they have a sixth sense. And some animals can eat things that we cannot eat. The banana slug, for example. You may, if you do a lot of walks in the woods, you'll have seen banana slugs eating dog droppings. Doesn't mean that dog droppings are edible. And And there's some real common sense safety rules that do apply and should be followed, and they include: don't eat gooey, half-decayed mushrooms. They should be nice and fresh and pristine, really good shape. And you wouldn't eat a fish if it's going soft and stinky and apart, you know? So don't do that with mushrooms. Old and partially deteriorated, poorly stored mushrooms are a major cause of gastrointestinal upset. Gather them from pristine areas. Don't eat mushrooms you find near roadways with heavy traffic, because all sorts of gunk comes out of cars. Don't eat them in an agricultural zone where it's likely that pesticides and other agricultural chemicals are used. Don't eat them from places that may have been a toxic waste dump at one point. Know the areas where you're picking the mushrooms. Find out a bit about the history of the area. There's an interesting phenomenon where there were big forest fires in Northwest Territories, and mushrooms were being analyzed for heavy metal compounds, toxic heavy metals, and it was found that some mushrooms growing way out in the forest, the morel mushrooms, where there'd never been mining, were chock full of heavy metals like arsenic, lead, mercury, all sorts of stuff, because the forest fire had smelted the rock, and it's an ore-bearing zone. So the rock substrate of the ground was essentially smelted by the forest fire, and the mushrooms accumulated the heavy metals. Mushrooms accumulate chemicals and metals. So, and pet wastes, if you're in a park area, and remember, people walk their dogs and there may be pet waste contaminating mushrooms. Mushrooms should always be thoroughly cooked. Some people say, oh, you can eat this mushroom raw or that mushroom raw, but eating raw or undercooked mushrooms is a major cause of gastrointestinal problems. So it's really safest to cook mushrooms and cook them well. And some mushrooms have toxins when they're raw, but are perfectly edible and considered choice when they're well cooked. And also it cleanses them, so it gets rid of bacterial contamination if they're cooked well. And eat them in moderation. Don't, just because you found some choice mushroom growing, 20,000 pounds of some choice edible, don't eat them, cook them up and eat them 3 meals a day until you're bloated, because you're going to get upset stomach. Mushrooms inherently are rather indigestible. They're made of chitin, which humans don't digest well. Same thing that makes up insect exoskeletons, and we don't digest insect exoskeletons very well, at least not in high-end restaurants around here. And so one problem that was recently realized is that a lot of mushrooms contain antibiotic compounds. They're very rich chemical factories, and the chemistry of mushrooms is extremely complex. And I worked on a project at UBC where we're extracting mushrooms and plating them out with bacteria, and we're doing what's called disc diffusion test, and we found almost 50% hit rate with just an assortment of wild mushrooms. So almost half of the mushrooms that we tested had some antibacterial property. And this means that if you eat a lot of mushrooms, especially if they're undercooked, you're going to disrupt your gut flora and you're going to have a gut ache, and it'll take a while before your gut settles down. So you'll get transient diarrhea, nausea, as the antibiotic compounds have wiped out the normal gut flora. And I usually recommend, I don't know if it's valid or not, that if you find that you might have overindulged in what you know is a good edible mushroom, eat a tub of yogurt and that should bind you up. Or eat a block of cheese and get a cheese plug. And some people can develop sensitivity to edible mushrooms. This is especially noted with the morel, choice edible morel. Quite a few people with time will develop sensitivity, and allergies are developed from exposure to things. So the body, after repeated exposures, puts out a defense to particular compounds that might be in the mushroom. Now that's some
causes other than actual poisons in mushrooms that can cause problems. There are also well-known toxins in many mushrooms, and a lot of mushrooms have toxins that we don't know yet, but they're known to be poisonous. And they're generally divided up into groups by the type of poisoning that they cause, the symptomology. And there are two sort of classes, generally speaking, short-acting and long-acting. So short-acting is where you eat something and then within a couple of hours, few minutes to a couple of hours, you begin to get nauseous and you'll have gastrointestinal symptoms. And there's some very serious poisonings that take a long time for the first symptoms to come on. And that's very serious because by that time your body's absorbed the toxins. You can't just eliminate the material that you ate easily. It's already in the bloodstream doing its damage. So as a rule with naturally occurring organic toxins, the longer it takes for the symptoms to appear, the more serious it may be. Some deadly mushrooms can take up to 2 weeks for the first symptom to occur. For this reason, it is not safe to just, if you don't know what a mushroom is, cook up a little bit of it, eat some, wait for 12 hours, and assume it's okay. Some toxins are very long-acting. And these long, slow, come-on toxins tend to affect particular organs of the body. So typically with serious mushroom poisoning, the liver and kidneys will be involved. And then with the short-acting stuff, usually you eat mushrooms, it's got some noxious compound in it that causes generalized gastrointestinal upset. You'll generally be vomiting out that meal that you ate. You get rid of the stuff that's in your body before it's all absorbed, hopefully. And usually the prognosis is pretty good with these rapid onset things. And if you get a really serious diarrhea and vomiting, you'll have to do fluid replacement and replace the minerals that you've lost and get a bit of bed rest and apologize to anybody you shared the mushroom dish with. And so it's always good to know what mushroom caused a poisoning, but we do not, when dealing with mushroom poisonings, have to know the mushroom and the toxin involved. Generally, treatment is symptomatic and it's responsive to the manifestations of the illness. And so there's a saying, treat the patient, not the mushroom. So with prompt treatment, close monitoring, even some fairly serious mushroom poisonings can be, it's possible to pull a patient through with minimal damage if response is quick. And there's all sorts of different toxins. There's numerous toxins involved, and these are just a few examples. So there's different molecular structures that go from very simple things like the monomethylhydrazine type toxins are found in false morels to very complicated polycyclic protein-like molecules that are very large and very complicated and full of all sorts of different nucleic acids forming big rings, and some very serious mushroom toxicity is involving complicated molecules, but not necessarily. And then there's difference in the way that they behave. So we have long onset ones that are 6 to 12 up to 36 hours. That's the big complex circular polypeptide type cyclopeptide thing that are found in the death cap and destroying angel. And then there's orlanin, they're found in quaternarias, and it takes up to 21 days for the first symptoms to come on. Can you remember what you ate 3 weeks ago? If you can, it was probably your birthday or some special festival day. Gyromitrin, false morels, that's a volatile toxin. It gases off when you cook the mushrooms, so a cook can actually get sick preparing a dish, but the people that eat the dish might not get sick. Coprinus atramentarius, the inky cap, has that. It doesn't cause problems on its own, but if you have alcohol with it, it interferes with the breakdown of alcohol, and you end up, it blocks the body's enzyme system that breaks down alcohol at a point where you accumulate toxins from partial breakdown of alcohol. And it's being used in the way that antabuse is used as a therapy for trying to get hardcore alcoholics to stop drinking. I'm not sure how. I guess you feed them the mushroom all the time in every meal, and then if they take a drink, they feel sick. It doesn't sound ethical to me. Then there's others that affect the mind. There's neurotoxins. Muscarine is something that affects the central nervous system, producing sweating. It's what's called an anticholinergic reaction. It causes perspiration, salivation, lacrimation. You generally sweat. I like to call it drool, sweat, and tears. And that's quite common in many different mushrooms, especially there's hundreds of species of Anosabe. Most of them are believed to contain muscarine. And ibotenic acid, muscimol, are in the red and white Amanita muscaria. It causes inebriation, delirium type of intoxication. Psilocybin psilocin is the magic mushrooms that I gave a talk earlier about. And gastrointestinal irritants are a whole bunch of things, different chemistry involved. There's different mechanisms. Sometimes it can be antibiotic compounds, like I mentioned earlier. It can be downright indigestibility. It can be nasty toxins that have not yet been characterized. Generally somewhat rapid onset, and generally just nausea, vomiting, abdominal cramps, diarrhea. And the number of mushrooms known to cause this sort of reaction are many, many, many. And that's something. There are a handful of really good edible mushrooms, thank you, and a handful of really nasty toxic mushrooms, and the vast majority of mushrooms fall in between. So you don't really want to go out and boldly try a mushroom where no one has tried before, because we just don't know enough. There's so many mushrooms and so little time. So few people. So then there's other ones. Amanita smithiana is mistaken for pine mushroom, causes kidney failure, which is often with a week of dialysis, the kidneys resume function, so it's not been known to be deadly yet. Pixillus involutus is the only mushroom to actually kill a professional mycologist. Jacob Schaffer in 1945 ate a bunch of Pixillus involutus and died. He was just released from a concentration camp and was already very sick and starved, and he had no other food, so he ate Pixillus and died of kidney failure. And it is with repeated exposure that some European people eat that all the time, apparently without harm. Other people eat it 2-3 times in a row and then suddenly have an autoimmune reaction, and their white blood cells begin to destroy their red blood cells, and they go into pernicious acquired anemia, which can be life-threatening. And Amanita franchetti, this is an example. This is quite a common Amanita, now called Augusta. And in China, it was reported that they had a spate of deaths caused by this mushroom. It grows quite commonly in parts of BC. And it's always been, people avoid it because it's an Amanita. And this was the first actual incident where it pointed to it as a possible culprit in serious poisoning. So it shows that we don't know as much about mushrooms as we'd like to. And then there's edible poisonous mushrooms, edible mushroom poisonings. Latiparus sulphureus, chicken of the woods, can cause gastrointestinal upset, especially if it's overage, undercooked. And we've had hallucinosis and neurological symptoms from a young child eating the raw material. And morels are infamous. Some people cannot tolerate morels. Morels are known to be poisonous if they're raw or undercooked. And the angel wings, Pleurisabella porogens, caused several deaths in Japan, caused convulsive encephalopathy. A group of elderly men who had kidney disease and they're undergoing active dialysis periodically had eaten this mushroom and died of basically brain fever, as it's called, an encephalopathy. And that is unknown why or how that happened, but obviously people that have kidney disease and are undergoing dialysis are already profoundly sick and may have issues breaking down whatever compounds might have caused that. And then there was an incident in France, several deaths, when the man on horseback mushroom was being eaten in huge quantities, and these are people that are finding lots and lots of it and eating it several times a day for several days in a row. Again, it's a popular edible mushroom that many people have been eating for many years, and this was the first report of it causing problems, actually caused fatalities. We used to say that, well, we don't have really serious poisonous mushrooms in BC other than little brown ones. Now we do. And some years ago, the death cap was found in British Columbia, the most deadly mushroom in the world. It was introduced to California, began to grow there. I think the first ones were found in the 1930s. They've been spreading north. They're now in Oregon, Oregon, Washington, and in British Columbia. In 1997, we found the first BC specimens in the Fraser Valley. In 2008, the first one showed up in Vancouver. This year to date, we have identified so far 70 locations where they grow in Vancouver. These are a very good mushroom to get to know. We have several on the table there. Look at them, get to know what they look like. They have the deadly cyclopeptide toxins, the big round molecule of nucleic acids all stuck together, and they have a delayed reaction. You eat them, and then 12 to 36 hours later you begin to get really sick, severe cramping, pain, very painful, diarrhea, vomiting, the liver is damaged, kidneys are damaged. That symptoms will last for a day or two, and then there's an apparent period of remission, and then the compounds have been circulating around the system, broken down in the liver, damaging the liver in the process. They're sort of fragmented back into the bloodstream, circulate around and reassemble, and a second wave of symptoms comes on, and that's usually the fatal episode eventually. We've had so far 2 deaths that I know of in Vancouver from cyclopeptide poisoning, amatoxin poisoning. This is what the Amanita phalloides looks like. It has a cup at the base of the stem. That's called the death cup, and the mushroom's called a death cap often. It has a greenish colored cap with a satiny sheen. In dryish weather, it almost looks, it has this shiny, sort of silky or satiny sheen. It's quite an attractive mushroom. It's supposed to taste very good, according to those that have eaten it. It smells god-awful. I've been drying out the specimens that we obtained from each new location, and they smell like death, as one person put it. They smell like an old skanky, slimy, rotting ham bone or something. They have this really weird proteinaceous decay smell as they dry out. But apparently they taste quite nice when they're fresh and young. They're often mistaken by people from southern Asia, warm parts of Asia, tropical, semi-tropical Asia, for the straw mushroom, a major mushroom of cultivation, edible mushroom sold in markets. So quite often people from Asia will find them, the death cap growing, and mistake them for the young mushrooms of the straw mushroom that they're used to back home. They do not have Amanita phalloides in tropical, subtropical countries. It's a temperate mushroom. And we try to document the mushroom as it occurs, so specimens are dried out and preserved for the UBC Herbarium, which is the Botanical Museum at the BD Museum of Biodiversity. And so I magic with this beard. I can brush it really rapidly to build up a static charge, and then I suspend the mushrooms in midair to take clever photographs. Just in case you wondered how that was done. This is courtesy the Vancouver Sun. It was a picture for an article that we wrote. This is one of the other mushrooms that contain the deadly amatoxins or cyclopeptides, Galerina. And they're very common as weed mushrooms in gardens. There's also little delicate conosities that have a ring on the stem. They contain the deadly amatoxins. There are little Lepiota mushrooms that contain the amatoxins. This is, we find quite often that unrelated mushrooms have the same toxins. So again, you really have to know your mushrooms. There's no simple way to tell if something has amatoxins in it other than by the symptoms you'll get should you eat it. This is orolanin. This is a really scary one that has a toxin that takes up to 3 weeks to take effect. And it destroys the kidneys. And we know that these are poisonous, deadly, through the misfortune of 2 groups of military personnel in 2 separate incidents in the 1950s. In one case, it was a survival exercise for the British Army in Scotland, and a whole bunch of people from different bases around Great Britain assembled there, and these soldiers went in and out and built shelters and gathered wild foods and did this whole survival trip, including making a big stew of mushrooms. And then they dispersed after the exercise to their different bases, and they began to drop dead of kidney failure. Eerily, in just about the same year, right around the same time, there was a similar incident in Poland where military personnel went out to do survival training. They came from different places in Poland, and they did a survival exercise, built a mushroom stew, ate it, then dispersed to their various bases and began to drop dead of kidney failure. And that's how we found out that these were poisonous. If it hadn't been for those 2 mass poisonings, we probably to this day would not know that these are deadly because of the length of time after exposure before the symptoms come on. There's no treatment but kidney transplant for that type of poisoning. Mushrooms are not uncommon. This was a huge fruiting that I found locally of about half a kilometer from here. And there are thousands of these fruiting bodies in a cluster under some trees in the park. And so it's conceivable that people could get into these. They're not a particularly attractive mushrooms. Now, another type of mushroom poisoning is the false morel poisoning, the monomethylhydrazine. Hydrazines, recent years it's been found that, well, it's been known that these cause poisonings. Very anomalous things happen, like a person would cook up a bunch of these mushrooms and the cook would get sick, but he'd feed them to a group of people and none of those people would get sick. There is a cannery in Europe where they were canning these, and the cannery workers got sick, but the people eating the canned product weren't getting sick. It turns out it's a volatile compound, so it steams off on cooking. And that's why these incidents were happening. It's now, the story of the discovery of the hydrazines being the toxin is interesting. The Jet Propulsion Lab in Pasadena, California, was working with what they thought was a synthetic fuel that didn't exist in nature called monomethylhydrazine. And they were testing it as a rocket propellant. And a whole bunch of the chemists and other personnel working in the labs got very sick. And they were eventually able to track down that it was a monomethylhydrazine that had caused this. And one of the physicians involved in the investigation was apparently talking to one of his colleagues who had a couple of interesting mushroom poisoning cases. And he said, I read your paper on the monomethylhydrazine, and it's really eerie because we have the same symptoms with a couple of mushroom poisonings. And so they sort of collaborated and managed to gather a bunch of these mushrooms, tested them, and found that they contained hydrazines, including monomethylhydrazine. Now, it's recommended, people used to say that you could cook and eat false morels, that because it's volatile it cooks out, but it's now known that these are horrendously efficient, powerful carcinogens, and hydrazines are now used to induce tumor growth in rats as for experimental purposes. So it's now recommended that you avoid all false morels. And make sure if you do eat morels and other cup fungi, Ascomycete, edible mushrooms, that you cook them very thoroughly, just in case they may have trace amounts of hydrazines. And Gyromitra esculenta is another one mushroom false morel that contains the hydrazines. And there's Finnish people are crazy, according to a friend of mine who's a Finnish mycologist. And he said, oh, don't listen to what any Finn says about edibility of mushrooms because they're nuts and they'll eat anything. So this is a Finnish mushroom book that I have, and it has symbols. So the dagger is poisonous, 3 daggers is deadly. The little asterisk means edible, and 3 asterisks means choice edible. And then the circle means it must be cooked. So this is a deadly choice edible mushroom that must be cooked. And it's the old, Finland was the last country in the world to permit the selling of false morels in markets. And I think now they've prohibited it. Coprine, this is the stuff that is in the shaggy, the inky caps, and it breaks down, it blocks certain enzymes that are responsible for breaking alcohol down. So there's a particular stage or 2 at which your own enzymes are blocked if you've eaten this mushroom, and the alcohol that you've ingested is broken down to the point where it's toxic ketones, etc., that can cause very nasty symptoms. So this is poisonous only when ingested with alcohol. There's, I mentioned muscarine. This is the drool, sweat, and tears mushroom. And there's several different mushrooms that contain muscarine. And there's Clytosabe is one. And there's, muscarine is almost unique as far as I know in mushroom toxins. It's the only one that has specific antidote. Atropine can be administered and directly counteracts the activity of muscarine on the nervous system. But otherwise, I know of no other specific antidotes for mushroom poisoning. All sorts of Inocebi species are known to contain muscarine. And we have a lot of poisonings, many of them fatal, involving small breeds of dogs, especially young puppies, eating Inocebes. And there's hundreds of species of Inocebi, and most of them are considered suspect as being potentially muscarine containing. So, May 23, 2011, I was called to consult on a poisoning case. A 2-year-old Chihuahua had been found dead in a backyard. The owners had seen it eating mushrooms. They were able to gather the mushrooms that they'd seen the dog eating and get them to the poison control center, who got them to me. And I was able to identify them as being Inocebi mixtilis. And this involved microscopic examination of the mushrooms. So this is what the sample looked like that I received. And I was able to examine it under the microscope. It has these distinctive little cells on the gills that have little crystal caps on the end, thick-walled cells. And then the spores are all knobbly, so very distinctive looking spores. So I was able to identify this mushroom as Inocebi mixtilis. It did not help the dog, though. And for some reason, we find a lot of these dog fatalities involve breeds like Chihuahua, Pekingese. Very small body weight, wound up metabolism, just super active little dogs. And I guess because they're generally house dogs or lap dogs, they don't get out much. And when they do, they tend to eat things. And they, especially a lot of anosabes, smell funny. So here we've got neurological intoxicants or magic mushrooms. The Amanita muscaria contains ibotenic acid, which is converted into muscimol and muscazone as the mushrooms dry or if they're cooked or when they're partially digested. And it acts as an inebriant, sort of an intoxicant. It's not an hallucinogen, it's more of a deliriant. And some people experiment around with them to get intoxicated from them, but I've met very few people that repeat the experience. It's not an enlightening sort of intoxication for most people. And it's good to learn the characteristic appearance of the mushroom. It's a beautiful mushroom. Everybody knows it's a toadstool, and people don't really eat it by mistake thinking it's an edible mushroom. But they are really beautiful, and people kick them over, and I wish people wouldn't, because they're gorgeous mushroom. And there's one location where I found the first place in Vancouver where the death cap was found. And I found repeatedly that people would kick over the Amanita muscaria that grows under the tree. They leave the deadly death cap alone. Misdirected energy. The ironic thing is that when you kick mushrooms around, it helps to spread the spores too. Doesn't get rid of them. So Amanita muscaria can come in different color forms, white through yellow, orange, and there's even a brown form. There's another mushroom closely related, Amanita pantherina, which has whopping great amounts of the same toxins. And it causes severe intoxication, inebriation in some cases. And we had a fatality in Nanaimo where a teenage young man had eaten Amanita pantherina with a lot of alcohol ingestion, and he aspirated, choked on his vomit when he had passed out and was unresponsive. Otherwise, the Amanita muscaria, pantherina, ibotenic acid, muscimol is rarely fatal. There's only been cases of overdosing on the antidote when it was thought muscarine was the main toxin and the atropine was administered, which actually exacerbates the toxins. Psilocybin, psilocin are the classic magic mushrooms that people recreationally eat or that are now being used for therapeutic purposes or were used ceremonially and ritually in Central America. And that's a compound in there called psilocybin, closely related to our brain chemical serotonin. And so it acts on the very same chemical pathway that's involved with sleep and with dreaming, etc. And it's a true hallucinogen. And by the way, I was somewhat chagrined to find that serotonin is illegal to possess in Australia, even though we all have it in our brain. So I thought that it would be interesting to declare if I ever go to Australia that I've got an illegal substance in my head. And so there we've got the Liberty Cap psilocybin. 1 gram dry weight is the general dosage used of the magic mushrooms. And a lot of problems with the magic mushrooms comes from inexperienced users, people being given them without their knowledge or consent, or people that are borderline psychiatric. These are where the problems lie with the psilocybin type intoxication. And there's various other mushrooms, Paniolus, that contain them, Gymnopolis. Ergot is a fungus that contains toxins of 2 different types, and it's infamous as the source of LSD. It also is the source of St. Anthony's fire, because some of the compounds constrict fine blood vessels and cause gangrene. And so people's limbs have fallen off after they've been poisoned by bread containing ergot. It's believed that the Salem witch trials may have been sparked by ergot poisoning. And that's LSD originated from compounds found in ergot. And then we get to this gastrointestinal. Vast majority of mushroom poisonings involve vomiting, diarrhea, gastrointestinal, just generalized symptoms. And there's lots of different mushrooms that can do this. Hebelomas are infamous for that. One of the common names is poison pie, which is what we call a clue in the toxicology world. No, in the mushroom world, it's what we call a clue. And sometimes habitat can be a clue. Some hebelomas grow from decaying bodies. They're called corpse finders. And this is an example of choose your habitat well. If you're going to eat mushrooms, don't eat them from a decaying corpse, right? So this is, and hebelomas are generally nasty. Various lactarius that exude juices, white or colored, can be toxic. And these are generalized gastrointestinal sickness. And most of them that are cause problems are also very acrid tasting or hot and peppery. And there's a couple of well-known good edible lactarius, but the vast majority of them you don't want to touch. Ramarias, these coral mushrooms, some people of European, Northern European especially, origin will cook and eat all sorts of ramarias and claim that they're all good edibles. But there are some that have streaks of gelatinized tissue in the base, and those are considered to be poisonous. It's believed that several species with this gelatinized streakiness in the base cause gastrointestinal upset. There are things that can grow on mushrooms that are poisonous. So this is a black mold or gray mold that grows on a lot of coral mushrooms, and it contains nasty carcinogenic toxins. And so you want to avoid mushrooms that look like they might be parasitized, or any coral with gray colors on it I would avoid for that reason. This is the report from China of Amanita franchetti, and a very odd because it was fairly fast uptake of symptoms, 2 to 15 hours. It was typical gastrointestinal, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, achiness. It was described as being very much like coming down with a bad stomach flu, which is, I guess, code word for food poisoning, and pain and dizziness, abdominal distension. And then oddly enough, after apparently having symptoms ease off, several people died of heart failure. And it was, it's not being explained to this point, but this is an example of how we don't know a lot about mushrooms in general and poisonous mushrooms in particular. It's a beautiful mushroom, by the way, this Amanita franchetti, or Augusta as it's now called. Amanita smithiana is mistaken for the pine mushroom. And we've had several cases in BC involving this, always cases where people mistook it for pine mushrooms. Most cases, the Amanita smithiana were growing with the pine mushroom nearby, and they were picked thinking it was just another pine mushroom. No, they're much softer, sort of tend to go flabby. They have a very different odor. They've got crumbly white stuff that comes off on the fingers when you handle them. And but if you're after, you're finding a bunch of pines and there happens to be one little button in amongst them that, it's, so far it appears some people have been able to even cut them up and cook them up without noticing the difference. For example, October 2011, a 63-year-old male consumed soup made from wild mushrooms, a mixture of them on one of the Goofy Islands, Gulf Islands. And he identified the mushrooms as puffballs, meadow mushrooms, and the prince, Agaricus augustus, and pine mushroom. And he had samples of the cold leftover soup were sent to me, and I was able to pick out pieces of mushrooms and sort them out into, indeed, what appeared to be puffballs, meadow mushrooms, the prince, and there was the pine mushroom in there too, plus Amanita smithiana. He had boiled them up in water and then added onions, garlic, and cream. And 4 hours after he ate the soup, he became ill. 20 hours, began to manifest symptoms of kidney failure and presented at hospital. And he was in there for 2 weeks, or for 9 days. He underwent several sessions of dialysis, kidney dialysis, and then the kidneys began to recover function. So far, in all cases of Amanita smithiana poisoning, the kidneys have recovered function, and there is apparently in radiographic X-ray examination, you can see some scarring on the kidneys, but they otherwise appear to be functioning okay. We don't know yet the long-term sequelae or, implication. We don't know when these people begin to get into their age, whether the kidneys, most elderly people die of kidney failure ultimately anyway, so I suppose. So I was given the soup and examined the fragments found in the soup and found some microscopic characteristics typical of the Amanita smithiana, these oval spores that turn blue in iodine solutions of the right size and shape to be Amanita smithiana. It's tough doing this because there's also a lot of starch granules, oil globules, food remnants of stomach contents, have a lot of other stuff that make examination difficult. But and then there's certain, with a bit of luck from the base, if some mushroom material is presented uncooked, I can retrieve cells from the exterior of the mushroom that aids in identification. So there's some characteristic cells found in the veil. And then the material was sent over to Germany, to the Innsbruck, Austria, sorry, not Germany. And so it was examined through paper thin layer chromatography, paper chromatography. And there was the liquid broth from the soup. There were the chunks of mushrooms isolated from the soup. There was a dried specimen of Amanita smithiana from a herbarium or plant museum, mushroom museum. And negative control, as it's called, a soup made of death cap mushrooms, Amanita phalloides. And at this point where the arrow is the characteristic orangey mark of the toxins involved, which was absent from the negative control. And the positive control, the herbarium specimen, shows the toxin present there. And then it was equally as strong in the broth as in the chunks of mushroom. So there isn't a safe thing. If you're fed a dish of mushrooms, you're afraid of the mushrooms that were used in it. It's no good picking out the chunks of mushrooms and eating the rest of it, because the toxins may well have diffused into the other rest of the food that the mushrooms were in. Oh, the recipe's at the bottom for the death cap soup, by the way. So it's made with Amanita phalloides, Orocmus badius, onion, celery, pepper, salt, egg, and cream. Yum. Okay. And Paxillus involutus, this is the one that killed a professional mycologist. It's something that you develop chronic exposure to it. A few exposures causes an autoimmune reaction, and your white blood cells begin to destroy the red blood cells. And it's been known to be fatal in at least one case. And these are quite common, one of the more common mushrooms around the city. There's some boletes that stain blue, have red tubes, mows, these little underside is like a sponge. And so if you see a bolete that has red in the tube layer where the spores are produced and stains blue, it's a warning signal that they are toxic. Okay, a lot of pink spored entelomas are poisonous, and so all entelomas should be avoided. Tricholomas, Spardinum's infamous as causing fairly rigorous GI workout, as we would say, intense nausea, vomiting, and may not kill you, but you may wish that it did. Which applies also to these. The earth balls, they resemble puffballs, but they're dark inside even when they're young. They have dark material inside, and they cause extremely unpleasant gastrointestinal symptoms. Agaricus, the meadow mushroom is very common, very well known and popular. The edible button mushroom is very familiar to us. The genus Agaricus has lots and lots and lots of mushroom, lots of species in it. And a lot of these we don't know yet. There are new species being described all the time. It's a very difficult bunch of mushrooms to sort to species. Very difficult group to work with. And some agaricus are quite nasty gastrointestinal toxins. Fortunately, they mostly have unpleasant creosote-like odor, like glue or like waterproofing. And then there's the edible mushroom poisonings. This is Pleurosobella porogens, or angel wings, which killed several Japanese men, elderly Japanese men with pre-existing kidney disease undergoing dialysis at the time that they ate the mushrooms and got sick and died. They were actively undergoing treatment for kidney disease. So I would say if you're an elderly Japanese man with kidney disease, or you plan to become one, don't eat angel wings. And this one, very similar looking thing to angel wings, caused a whole spate of deaths in one part of China, Yunnan province, China. And the doctors couldn't figure out the toxins. It took a lot of work to try to figure out what was going on. It turned out to be a previously unknown species of mushroom. And so they decided, well, we got to do something about this. So they made up a name. They called it SUD, sudden unexplained death. And so SUD, and then it was okay because they had a name for it. And and they passed legislation in Yunnan prohibiting eating of wild mushrooms, which apparently wasn't too successful. Latiparus conifericola is also, there's Latiparus sulphureus and a couple of other Latipari. And they can cause gastrointestinal symptoms, or we had a case of a young child eating them who experienced hallucinations and ataxia, inability to walk and move around normally. She had apparently visions in yellows, oranges, and reds, mostly of monsters chasing her. And then she was hospitalized, kept under observation, recovered after about 6 or 7 hours with no treatment other than mild sedatives to calm her down a bit. Unexplained at this point. Raw chicken of the woods mushroom from a plum tree in the city. The household and yard was checked out thoroughly and no intoxicants, hallucinogens. The family apparently had a very clean household, weren't into drugs, medications, anything of that sort. They didn't have toxic household cleaners around, so they were able to eliminate possible other causes, and it just left that fungus that she'd eaten. And this is the Tricholoma equestrae, or flavovirens, man on horseback. People found huge quantities one year in France, ate large quantities over and over again, and experienced wasting of muscle tissue, rhabdomyolysis it's called, and that swamps the body, the system, with breakdown products from the protein of your muscles, and it overtaxes the kidneys and causes kidney failure and death in several people in France. Up to that point, these had always been considered very good, edible, safe mushrooms. In Japan and Taiwan, this russula was being eaten and caused rhabdomyolysis too, very similar to what happened with trichomona. It wasn't repeated exposure, so I think it was just single or occasional exposure, but caused the same muscle wastage over swamping of the body with breakdown products. And then just recently there was a review of 30-40 years of mushroom poisoning records from the Rocky Mountain Poison Control Center in Colorado and the North American Mycological Association Toxicology Database. And when they reviewed all the data, they suddenly realized that leccinums, which have always been considered safe edible boletes, cause a lot of gastrointestinal poisonings, especially in Colorado. And we don't know which leccinums. It's a complex group. There's lots of species. They're hard to sort out. Most people that ate them weren't able to say much other than there's some type of leccinum that they ate. So now caution is recommended with the leccinums. The shiitake, cultivated shiitake, is okay dried. You can buy it in Chinese markets dried or Japanese markets dried. But when they're fresh, and they're more and more available fresh in this area now, if they are not thoroughly cooked, or even sometimes when they are seemingly well cooked, but if they're especially raw or just lightly cooked, they cause a type of rash, what's called flagellate erythema, which almost looks like somebody's been scratched or lashed with a whip, and causes these angry red lines. And I don't know if it has to do with it's not known exactly what causes the particular patterning, but this happens in about, I think, 10 to 12% of people that eat lightly cooked shiitake. So if you're eating shiitake, cook them thoroughly. They're delicious, healthful, even medicinal mushrooms when they're well cooked or when they're dried and then soaked and revived. But if they're undercooked, they can cause this rash.
What about a tea, like a shiitake?
Yeah, that'd be okay, yeah. And then Agaricus blazei is being promoted. There's all sorts of products on the health food alternative medicine market. There are a few cases in Japan where cancer patients were self-medicating, because these things are supposed to be anti-tumor, and these people were undergoing conventional chemotherapy treatments for different types of cancer. I think it was ovarian, breast, and some other cancers, and they were self-medicating, and it resulted in liver failure, and they were hospitalized, and some of them pulled through the liver failure. And in one case, a woman who had got very close to dying of liver failure was brought back from the liver failure, finished up that round of chemotherapy. Her cancer went into remission for a period, then it re-emerged, went metastatic upon her, and then she began to resume chemotherapy, and then she started self-dosing again on these Agaricus blazei, had liver failure and died of the liver failure again, second round. So a lot of the alternative medicine, fungal medicines, mushroom medicines, are to be taken with a grain of salt, if it's organic salt, I guess. Now, they're to be cautious. Don't believe everything you hear or read about the alternative medicine mushrooms. And we have, I don't know if I have time to go into a bit of a diversion here, but I've been working on a project analyzing certain medicinal mushrooms for certain known active compounds. And we've been looking at various products on the market, and some of them have no content of the active constituents that they're being sold for. And some of them are grown, they say that mycelium products is supposed to have the whole life force of the mushroom in it. So a lot of companies are selling mushroom preparations made out of mushroom mycelium grown on grain, dried out and then ground up. And these contain virtually no fungal tissue. We've been testing them for presence of cholesterol and beta-glucans, which are fungal specific compounds. And we're not finding much level in these products. What we're finding is lots of starch. So you're paying a lot of money for what's essentially moldy grain. And some of the levels of ergosterol is used to analyze grain samples imported into Canada to detect fungal contamination. It's fun as I've been giving these talks, there have been people looking for mushrooms out there, so I can watch the mushrooms as I talk about the... Okay, so, and then morels are toxic raw, and Vancouver is a wonderful place for colorful mushroom poisoning. Some years ago, we had a spectacular mushroom poisoning where the police chief had retired. They had a big banquet for him in a major hotel. There were 300 plus Mickey Mucks and bureaucrats and celebrities there for this big banquet. They were served a salad with raw morels. 16% of the people got sick. 88 out of 360 some people got sick, including the provincial health officer, who was one of the first who had to dash to the porcelain throne. And a fairly good gastrointestinal workout for the people affected. There was only one hospitalization. That was a man who had sufficient nausea, vomiting, diarrhea that he became severely dehydrated and had to go in for fluid replacement and electrolyte topping up. And he ate double portion because his wife refused to eat mushrooms, didn't like mushrooms. So I've always thought the conversations after that between them must have been quite colorful. And so that caused a lot of concern about how much do chefs, professional cooks know about preparation of mushrooms. A lot of people don't know much about proper handling, storage, selection, preparation of mushrooms. So there's all sorts of poisonous mushrooms out there, and if you want to avoid poisonous mushrooms, learn a handful of really good choice edibles that are distinct, characteristic, that you know grow around, and stay with those, be comfortable with those, and don't get adventuresome. There's an expression that says there are old mushroom hunters and bold mushroom hunters, but no old, bold mushroom hunters. But I did know one man, the late Charles Barrow, and he had a t-shirt printed up that said, "Old, bold mushroom hunter." He's no longer with us, unfortunately. So that's it. So just please use caution. And the mushrooms may look tempting, but remember that there are traps out there waiting to pare down the population, waiting to weed out the unfit among us.
What about the red Marcellus?
Some of them are hot and peppery, probably indigestible. One red russula has the name Russula emetica, which may be what we again call a clue in the technical parlance there. Okay, and this, by the way, something about mushrooms. Once you get onto mushrooms, some of you, if you're just being introduced to the subject intensively this weekend, might have mushroom dreams. And somehow you begin to see mushrooms everywhere. And a friend of mine got a book from a used bookstore and found this page at the back of it, and somebody had doodled this. And notice, cure for acute paranoia. Right. Anyway, so that's that talk.